You all know Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. This is his first visit with our Better Journalism Through Bacon group. We appreciate him coming.
Is that what it's called? Better Journalism Through Bacon?
Well, that's what we call it in our more mordant moments. Our guest was born in Kansas, where his parents had settled after fleeing Nazi Germany. He grew up in California and won, as he said, a basketball scholarship to the University of California, Santa Barbara. And after playing 2 seasons of Division I ball there, he transferred, as he said, to Stanford, graduating with honors. He moved to Oregon to attend the University of Oregon Law School. After law school, our guest founded the Oregon chapter of the Gay Panthers and Gray Panthers. What did I say? Gray. And according to the Almanac of American Politics, in his first foray into electoral politics, successfully sponsored a referendum lowering the price of dentures. In 1980, at age 31, he ran for and won a seat in the U.S. House, where he served until being elected to the Senate in 1996. So much for biography. Now on to mechanics. As always, we're on the record here. Please, no live blogging or tweeting or filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway to give us time to actually listen to what our guest says. There's no embargo when the session ends. To help you resist that relentless selfie urge, we'll email several pictures of the session to all the reporters here as soon as the breakfast ends. As regular attendees know, if you'd like to ask a question, please do the traditional thing and send me a subtle, non-threatening signal, and I'll happily call on one and all. We're going to start off by offering our guests the opportunity to make some opening comments, and then we'll move to questions from around the table. And with that, thanks again for doing this, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave, and my thanks to all of you for coming out. And it'd be cruel and unusual punishment to give you a big speech on a Friday morning, and I'm not going to do that. And I thought I'd make 3 points very quickly. First, I think that this week in the Senate was one where you saw some ice starting to break. Certainly the Medicare package with children's health, this is something I've been involved in for well over a decade. The idea that you are going to take this, outdated, inefficiency rewarding, common sense defying Medicare reimbursement system and throw it in the dustbin of history. It should have been done years ago. And I happen to think if we could have gotten a recorded vote last year on my proposal to repeal and replace it, we would have either gotten very close or we would have won. So I think that is long overdue. If you had told people a few weeks ago, for example, that there would be a prospect for a bipartisan compromise on the Iran review legislation, everybody would have just rolled their eyes or just started laughing outright. I think that's very good. And of course, as we'll talk about this morning, we're starting to make some bipartisan headway on the trade issue. So that's point number one. Point number two is obviously our economy and that of many other countries has some growing to do. And that's, I think, was driving my position on everything from tax reform to trade to transportation. 3 big economic issues that you're going to hear a lot about in the upcoming weeks. And the focus is all about a fresh strategy to grow middle-class wages. And in a sense, these issues to some extent are interrelated. And let me give you an example. The Senate on the budget debate voted, more than 70 senators voted for my legislation to make middle-class tax relief the centerpiece of the tax strategy now. We can get you how every senator voted. It was a very strong Senate vote. More than 70 senators voted for it. And it is the centerpiece of the bipartisan tax reform bill that I've had now for a number of years as well, starting with Judd Gregg, who was, when he was in the Senate, Mitch McConnell's economics lieutenant. But it also relates to the trade debate, which formally launched yesterday in the Senate Finance Committee. The way I see it, there is a growing middle class in Asia. The developing world is looking at a population that could double between now and 2025, making up 1 billion households. And these are people who are going to be interested in buying goods and services. And it's my belief that with an export-oriented economy and the kinds of changes, tariff relief and other changes that I'm proposing, the bipartisan proposal yesterday, we are going to see more Asians buying more goods and services from America, and that will create more employment opportunities for Americans. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 deals with the trade issue specifically. I think the central question on the trade issue that people have been asking me, they'll come up and say, Ron, what is different from this in the 1990s? That's essentially what the question. And here are the major differences. One, this proposal has unprecedented transparency. I can tell you I finished town hall meeting number 727 over the weekend in Coos Bay, Oregon, and I can tell you that most Americans and a lot of elected officials have in the past felt in the dark about trade proposals and trade legislation. And people would come to town hall meetings and say, I don't know what's in it. And they would ask legislators, and there are all kinds of rules about what you can say and when you can say it. With this proposal, those days are over. By law, the TPP and any other piece of trade legislation will have to be published 60 days before the President of the United States signs it. After that, it is likely to be another 2 months before Congress actually starts voting on trade. So that means you are looking at, as part of this new approach on transparency, you are looking at being in the vicinity of 4 months of the American people and their elected officials knowing what's in a trade agreement before a single vote is cast. That is very different than the 1990s. Second, this contains a process to ensure that Congress can put the brakes on a bad trade agreement. We can talk, if you really want root canal work, about exactly how it works, and I'm happy to do that, but that is also very different. Third, there is a fresh approach in terms of enforcing trade law. And that is hugely important because the first question a lot of people ask is, gee, why would you folks in Washington, D.C. be talking about a new trade agreement when you aren't enforcing the laws on the books? This includes my Enforce Act. It includes a fresh approach in terms of a kind of early warning system for unfair trade practices, import surges, and the like. And that's hugely important because people have always said that they really didn't know what was going to be the challenge until it was too late. Labor and environmental issues become core requirements, enforceable core requirements. They are not side deals like they were in the 1990s. That's important. And there is a major upgrade in our policies with respect to digital goods. We're talking about improved information flows. You heard yesterday that I asked Ambassador Froman about whether there were any anti-internet bills, anti-internet bills like PIPA and SOPA, which I led the effort in the Senate to block a couple of years ago. He answered no. So that's what's different between this and the 1990s. Softball questions, especially welcome. Let's just talk about what you're interested in.
I'll do a couple of softballs, and then we'll move to my colleagues. Let me start on the trade deal, obviously. There's a lot of talk that the fast track and TPP will split the Democratic Party, that there's a real political danger for Democrats in this. What's your assessment of the risk of splitting the party as an election year approaches?
Trade has never been for the faint-hearted, and I've recognized that for a long time, and I think that's why I led with the first point, Dave. Here are the differences between this and the 1990s. What I have tried to do, apropos of your point, is to try to say at every opportunity, I think those who have opposed these trade agreements in the past have valid points. For example, at my meeting in Coos Bay last weekend, probably the biggest concern was all the secrecy that surrounds it. And I'll tell you, I think a lot of this excessive secrecy has just been nuts. I'm going to use that word deliberately. Nobody's talking about giving out proprietary information about companies. Nobody's talking about giving out the secret sauce in Coke here. We're talking about people having some sense of what the general debate is all about and what the issues are and the tariff issues and the various other kinds of concerns. And if you believe strongly in trade, as I do, you shouldn't be in favor of all this excessive secrecy, because the only thing that excessive secrecy accomplishes is to make people more cynical about the whole process, because they say, what is everybody hiding? What is everybody hiding here? So I held out. As you know, the negotiations on this really went on for 6 months. I can't recall something being this focused for 6 full months. And one of the issues that I felt the most strongly about is this junking once and for all, this excessive, secrecy. I'm happy to have a debate about trade and the major kinds of issues. And Mr. White here, he's the Finance Committee counsel who did great work through this whole thing. One of the areas he and I focused on was, in the future, you would have to have made public reports about the negotiations with respect to trade policies. So, as you all know, I think TPP is moving into the home stretch. But when this gets enacted, you would have to get ongoing reports with respect to negotiations. So all of this, Dave, is a way to really make it clear that I think opponents of these past deals have some valid points. That's why labor and environmental standards are enforceable. That's why there's a fresh approach with respect to enforcement. That's why I fought so hard for the protections for internet freedom. You might have seen the blimps and the jumbotrons and all the things that have been following me around over the last few weeks. And I said, look, I've worked with activists for a long time. They've been key to a lot of the kind of reforms that I've been involved in, and they have valid points to make here. And what was announced yesterday is an effort to try to address them and to deal with essentially the underlying position that you're asking about, Dave. Does this cause division?
Split. Let me ask you one other sort of tied to your role on the Intelligence Committee, and then we're going to go to Eric Niles, Mark Heller, Tal Koppen, Lisa Mascaro, Sarah Sorcher, and Corey Bennett. There's a new study out, as I'm sure you're aware, by Norse and the American Enterprise Institute, concluding that Iran has greatly increased the frequency and skill of its cyber attacks, while at the same time negotiating with the United States and the rest of the P5+1 on its nuclear capabilities. And there's also a counter view out from the firm Cylance, saying there's been a noticeable drop in Iranian hacking over the past few months. Which assessment, in your view, is more credible?
No member of the Intelligence Committee is allowed under the Senate rules to answer that question in a public kind of
forum. Thought I'd try.
I hear you. But I'm not going to duck the whole question of cyber and intelligence, because I know a lot of you care about the cybersecurity issue, which is also probably coming up this month in the Senate, based on what I have seen from what certainly Mitch McConnell's got on his mind. The vote in the committee was 14-1 in favor of the cybersecurity legislation. I was the one opponent, and I'd like to take you through how I came to that judgment. It's something I feel very strongly about. First, it is indisputable that the cyber problem is a growing threat to America. Absolutely indisputable. We have seen it in Oregon, where we had one of our important companies that makes solar products hacked by China, really in retaliation for the company trying to enforce its rights. So it is indisputable that there is a growing cyber problem. I think it is also indisputable that there is value in companies sharing information that they have about cyber risks. So put me down, A, on the seriousness of the problem, and B, that there is real value in terms of companies sharing information. What is troubling, however, is if you share that information without strong privacy protections, what you're essentially talking about is a surveillance bill rather than a cybersecurity bill. And that is what I found so troubling. And I will tell you, while the vote was 14-1 in the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, there are a good group of senators who have approached us about saying they want to work for additional privacy protections when this bill comes to the floor. So I want that understood. Second, in the committee, and this was made public, and Mr. Dickus is not allowed to say anything, but he's our man on the Intelligence Committee. I offered an amendment to block the proposal that Mr. Comey, the FBI director, has sought to make. As you've probably seen, Mr. Comey's response to the strong encryption that companies feel is necessary to keep the confidence of their consumers, both in the United States and overseas, the response to Mr. Comey has been to say that we're interested in requiring companies to build weaknesses into their products so that we, in effect, can have a back door into their products when we feel that we need it. That is a breathtaking idea. And understand how we got to this point. The NSA overreaches with respect to how you strike the balance, where we're going to have security and liberty. The NSA overreaches. American companies find their brand getting hurt around the world and in the United States, with analyses have been done upwards of $30 billion, being lost in terms of economic opportunity with reduced consumer confidence. So the response of the companies was to go out in the private sector and build strong encryption into their products. What is the response of the federal government, which has in effect set in motion this problem by the overreach by the NSA? And the reason you know it's an overreach is because the president's own advisory committee says that they don't need to collect this metadata, these phone records on millions of law-abiding people to fight terror. The government's response through Mr. Comey to companies feeling that they need strong encryption is Mr. Comey shows up on the front pages of your papers saying that he wants to require companies to build weaknesses into their products. I think that is a very, very bad idea. If anybody is having trouble sleeping tonight, I wrote a long essay on this. It was in Lisa's paper. And one of the points that we made is once you start building weaknesses into products, make no mistake about it, it's not just the good guys that have the keys to get in. It's a lot of bad guys that can get in, which responds to Dave's point with respect to...
Can I do a real quick follow-up? You introduced an amendment to ban mandatory government backdoors on American electronics, and you were outvoted 3-12. Why is a backdoor ban so unpopular to your colleagues, do you think?
Well, first of all, it is not so unpopular. It passed in the House of Representatives by a very substantial majority. And my take on this, and I cannot discuss what was debated behind closed doors.
I'm sorry, try that again.
No. But,
I'll stop now.
Under the rules, after a certain period of time, you can state your views, you can announce your position, but I cannot say, in response to Dave's very good question, what members were saying behind closed doors. What I can tell you, because it's a matter of public record, the House, by a very large majority, voted for the proposal essentially that I offered. And I believe that in both the Senate and the House, as people become more familiar with this issue, there's going to be a lot of support for you. It's going to be very hard for a member of Congress to stand up in any corner of America and defend the proposition that the federal government, particularly after overreaching here, wants to require companies to build weaknesses into their products.
Eric Wasson from Bloomberg.
Two follow-ups. On trade, has the deal that you've negotiated now, do you have commitments from a majority of Democrats on finance to vote for this? Does it have enough Democrat support to pass the Senate or to pass the House? What's going to happen to this, and does it need to be changed?
Eric, I'm not going to get into announcing how each Democratic member of the Finance Committee is going to vote. I do believe when we get to a vote, and next week is going to be all about discussing these issues, trying to get various opinions out, I believe that we will win a strong vote in the Finance Committee. But I think everyone understands that there's a long, long way to go after this. And the President has indicated, told many of you in your publications that this is a big priority for him. And the President and I have talked about this on a number of occasions. And when the President said in the State of the Union address that past trade agreements didn't live up to their hype, that was very helpful because it helped to frame everything that I've been working for all of these last 6 months. It's why the opening comment that I made dealt with the differences between this and the 1990s. And I'll go one step further. One of the, I hope I'm not breaking all your equipment if I move back.
No. I'm sure he's got you beautifully framed.
The challenge of long legs and tables. Yeah. When you have these open town meetings, and I told you about what people were saying about in terms of Coos Bay, Oregon last weekend, one of the judgments you pick up is that Americans look at these processes and look at a lot of what was going on in Washington, and they say the game's rigged. And on the trade issue, they say the power's with the executive branch. They got these committees that deal with it, and a lot of the people who are on the committees, the leaders, are for these agreements. And so the game is sort of foreordained. It's kind of a rigged system. So one of my priorities in setting out on this journey is I wanted to ensure that there'd be a fairer fight and a fairer debate. And that's why, for example, I really went to the mat over these secrecy issues. And now when you look at the clock and how it works, and you're going to have the entire TPP and other agreements, this will start applying to TPP and other agreements, public for 4 full months before Congress people start voting, the 60 days and then the additional time. You're starting to have a fairer debate. You're starting to have a fairer fight. And that is a big part of what guided my thinking.
The Senate will get 6 Democrats on board to pass.
I'm not going to announce a vote total here. I believe there will be a Democratic support, number one. And number two, I believe it'll pass the Finance Committee. And there are members of the Senate who are not on the Finance Committee who have, if you just look at their past record, they have a long history of looking to expand opportunities for exports and global commerce.
Niles? CQ.
Senator, I want to introduce a new subject matter into the conversation this morning. I was talking just a couple of days ago to Senator Inhofe, and he said that he and Senator Boxer were waiting on the Finance Committee to help them out with the funding mechanism for the highway bill. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit to where those talks are and what the prospects for moving ahead on transportation are.
It is obviously fast approaching in terms of the deadline, and Chairman Hatch is going to have to lay out a marker in terms of where he wants to be, and Republicans. But let me kind of give you a sense of what I think the challenge is. There are really three approaches on the table right now. The first is the gas tax. And the Republican leadership's already announced that they're against going that route. Now, that has been the conventional way to finance highways and roads and basic services in the past. And as you know, there was a proposal in the last Congress to raise it. Senator Corker, Senator Murphy, and I think Senator Corker, who's done good work on so many issues, in my view, was not exactly seeing a big Republican flock gravitating to co-sponsor his bill. So go with that. And, of course, with the changing nature of transportation, that also affects whether the gas tax is the foundation, number one. Number two, many of my colleagues want to pursue approaches involving repatriation for transportation. And I personally think that as part of broader reform, there are ways in which to repatriate some American dollars and use it for a variety of purposes, including looking at infrastructure. But the idea that there is a repatriation rainbow between now and the date, I believe it's May 31st is the date when it actually expires. The idea that there's a repatriation rainbow, I just think is not borne out by the facts. And let me tell you why I feel that way. If you decide you want to deal with repatriation, as most of my colleagues have done in the past, on a voluntary basis, in other words, companies could voluntarily do it, the scorekeepers, the budget office and the taxation commission, JCT as it's called, they won't score it for you because they can't. They don't know what will happen. If you make it mandatory, then the companies head for the hills because they're not in favor of mandatory repatriation. So those are the first two entrants. The third entrant, which I'm spending most of my time on, at least until I get a sense of where Chairman Hatch wants to go on the funding issue, is I've been spending my time on the finance issue. In the Recovery Act, and it's one of my favorite stories, we have some of Chairman Baucus's former staff here. On the last night of the Recovery Act, Chairman Baucus called on me and had this wonderful way of saying, Ron's been talking about this idea for a long time, and he's a good guy, and bipartisan support, and he's got this bond thing, these Build America bonds. And I had, in fact, been flogging these for decades, really over a full decade. And I was a little surprised I was even called on, so I was kind of taken back. And I said, well, these are tax credit bonds, and for municipalities, they get a grant because they don't pay taxes. And so we get to the big question, what do you think is going to happen? I said, been talking to a lot of people who are knowledgeable about investments, and I bet you we can sell $3 to $5 billion worth of them. This is a year and a half. And everybody goes, oh my goodness, that Ron is always full of ideas, and he's out there talking about new things, and that $3 to $5 billion, federal government had never done it. Anybody know how many Build America bonds were sold? Over $180 billion worth of Build America bonds were sold in a year and a half. So I am working very hard and have been asking Republicans for their views on a successor approach, which largely, Nels, would involve tax credits and bonds and would be routed through the states and the localities so that Republicans and conservatives who want to fund infrastructure, and I've been spending a lot of time going person to person. The question was asked about the finance, members. I have been going person to person on the Republican side, talking to Republican members about what they think is the appropriate role for government and infrastructure and the like, and we'll have that proposal ready to go before long. It is, of course, financing as opposed to the funding issue, but it is obviously pretty important. And during the Recovery Act, when you needed to move fast, the option that many of the infrastructure projects that went forward during the Recovery Act were funded through Build America bonds, and the treasurer of my state, Ted Wheeler, actually put up all of the Build America bonds that were funded during that period, talked about how they saved money relative to the other alternatives, and that you could set them in motion, quickly.
Mark Keller from BNE.
Senator, on taxes, if you're to do some sort of corporate tax reform, you're going to have to find a way to compensate those small businesses that pay on the individual side of the code, the pass-throughs. There are obviously some ideas floating around about how to do that. What do you think has some promise? What do you think makes sense? And of the ideas that are out there, what do you think doesn't make any sense at all?
Mark, I'm not here to float any kind of specific, proposals. I'm not going to front my colleagues and Chairman Hatch on this. I think there are 2 points. First, I think that if the American people hear the words business tax cut, and the typical senator walks into their local hardware store, and the hardware store owner says, "Hey, I hear I'm getting a tax cut," and the senator looks at their shoes, because the tax cuts are primarily for the multinationals, people with C corporations. That's a non-starter. So the tax system is really kind of like an ecosystem. The pieces are fixed together. Now, in the proposal I've had with Senator Gregg and Senator Coates, we target a lot of the relief at the small business. People, we spend a lot of time asking the National Federation of Independent Businesses and others. So I have a bill out there that looks to do that. And, for example, the research and development credit, which we've begun to reform even in the extender debate, is really targeted at the small business. I mean, big companies. I have Nike, Intel in my state. We're going to make sure that larger firms have access to the research and development credit. But what I was concerned about is the small business, the person who's in their garage or their workbench. And we've begun to retool it. And when you're talking about the research and development credit for small business, you're basically going to pay wages for workers who are innovative and are adding value to the economy. So there have been a number of ideas in circulation, as you know, some sort of small business, credit. And if you really want to, again, kind of fall asleep quickly, I asked Governor Engler some questions about this very topic at the Finance Committee and asked him his thoughts with respect to small business credits and the like. But I don't think you can do tax reform if the American people walk away with the idea that tax reform is just for big guys. Big guys who have lobbyists and clout. That is pretty much going to kill the effort in the crib.
Town Copeland from Politico.
I'm going to attempt a Dave question, but if you can't answer it, I've got a backup just in case.
You're doing cyber?
On cyber, yes.
Oh.
So, not getting into what Iran is really up to, I wanted to ask you what you thought about the way that the government disclosed that Iran was behind the Las Vegas Sands attack versus the way it disclosed that North Korea was behind the Sony attack. So with North Korea, there was this big press conference. The president came out, made the announcement. With Iran, the director of national intelligence kind of just quietly slipped it into a threat assessment in a congressional hearing and mentioned it as a foregone conclusion that Iran had been behind the Las Vegas Sands attack. And now we say there were two big nation-state attacks last year. So I'm curious why you think
you're giving John Dickus back there a stomachache. I get 2 points. One, I obviously can't. I have some classified information with respect to the points, but I will tell you, since you mentioned John Brennan no longer has my confidence as the head of the CIA. And let me give you an example of the kind of development that has concerned me. John Brennan said on Andrea Mitchell's show that he had absolutely no interest in hacking in to the computers of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Millions of people saw that show. At essentially the same time, his communications person was writing an op-ed piece for USA Today. This is all a matter of public record, describing why they were interested in getting in the Senate files. You cannot reconcile those positions. And this is an example of what I call the culture of misinformation. And I'm directing it at the leadership of the CIA. I want it understood, I am not talking about the rank and file at the CIA and the intelligence community. America is so lucky to have those people. If you serve on the intelligence committee, you come out of those meetings saying, we are so fortunate to have these dedicated, committed professionals, thousands of them, who do so much good work to keep our families, safe. I have 3 children under 7, and they spend a lot of time in dangerous places, and I say to myself, thank goodness we've got those dedicated professionals, thousands of them, who day in and day out serve us with real courage and great professionalism. I do not feel that way about the intelligence leadership. I'm not going to go back through the history. As you know, I spent months trying to get an answer to statements that were being made by the intelligence leadership with respect to surveillance. And it really started with the previous director of the NSA, who said in a public speech, you can go look at it, we don't hold data on U.S. citizens. That's one of the most false statements ever made about American surveillance. And that and other comments in public, initiated by the intelligence leadership, was what caused me to ask Mr. Clapper in one of our few open hearings a question I did, and we received a false answer to that too.
Lisa Muscaro from the LA Times.
So just 2 questions if I could. One, your counterpart over in the House, Sandy Levin, has taken a very different approach on fast track. And I was just wondering if you could sort of assess his point of view. He says there's no reason to go down fast track until you get TPP right. And he would sort of prefer, as I understand it, to have more focus on getting TPP into a shape that could be agreeable. So I was just wondering if you could assess that. And then just secondly, I just was wondering, you've been sort of a champion on a lot of these issues that have been popular with your party, obviously the surveillance issue. You did secret hold, sort of filibuster reform back in the day. Now you're sort of on the other side to folks like, Elizabeth Warren, who's going to be very, going after this. Obviously the unions, it's going to get more difficult. I was just wondering if you could sort of personally assess that, especially as you're going into your re-election this year.
Well, Lisa, I've always said the best politics is good policy, and have put a focus in my time in the Senate. The number one thing I have tried to do is to say I'm a Democrat. I am proud to be a Democrat, and I'm an American too. And I'm going to do everything I can to try to break, the gridlock on some of these issues. For example, I think Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner deserve a lot of credit on this Medicare reform issue. I'll tell you, I was for changing the Medicare reimbursement system long before it was cool. You look back at my history, this has really been a fight over 15 years, and probably a big chunk of my time, and I've specialized, as you and I have talked about, on healthcare since my days with the Great Panthers, has been to change this flawed mess of a reimbursement system known as the Medicare SGR. It's always been, bipartisan. My tax reform proposals have been bipartisan. My transportation funding proposals have been bipartisan. Yesterday, was bipartisan. A lot of the intelligence reform efforts, I joined Rand Paul on the filibuster. So I'm very proud to be a Democrat, and I think being a proud Democrat is consistent with working for a lot of the reforms that I just mentioned. And we can go one issue after another. The big fight against PIPA and SOPA, I was thrilled to have Jerry Moran, who I think would tell you he's plenty conservative Republican, came up and said, I've really been watching this whole thing. I'd like to be involved. So I have tried to make that the focus of my work. Nobody's got 60 votes in the United States Senate so they can tell everybody what to do. So if you want to get stuff done, you got to work for common ground. And I like to think on some of those progressive issues. I just mentioned PIPA and SOPA and Senator Moran. I've been able to bring senators together, conservative senators, around some pretty progressive ideas. On TPP, 2 points. First, Sandy Levin has done very good work on these trade issues for a great many years. And he and I talk frequently, and I want it understood that I very much admire his professionalism, his contribution, not just on trade, but taxes and health and infrastructure and a variety of other areas. I made the judgment that it's pretty hard to deal with all of the trade opportunities if you don't have some set of modern rules to kind of be your lodestar. For example, on the question of putting the brakes on a flawed trade agreement, something that has never been done before, you got to change the rules in order to do something that, if you look back 10 years ago, progressive folks really wanted that. They would say, hey, you get to turn on fast track, how come you can't turn it off? Now, I understand that just because we have that in the bill, and I think it's an important development, doesn't mean that there's some magical kumbaya moment and everybody agrees. But that would be an example of why you need the rule change. Another one would be the secrecy, requirement. You want to require over the next few years that you have to have it on the record. You all will be able to sit at your desk for months to dissect every provision in the TPP and future agreements. You don't get that unless you deal with the rules.
Sarah Sorcher from the Monitor.
Where's Sarah? I'm moving.
Just wanted to follow up on the encryption question.
Yeah.
Would you go so far to say that this is another example of you losing faith in the intelligence leadership? You have senior leaders in intel and law enforcement coming out really strong on this issue in the name of what they say is for national security, but then you and other members of the security and tech community have equally strong objections in the name of consumer security. So,
it is different than the point that I made earlier with respect to Mr. Brennan and what Mr. Clapper said in an open forum. These were examples where their public statements didn't add up. They weren't straight with the American people. I gave you examples with Mr. Brennan, Mr. Clapper, and Mr. Alexander, where they said things in public that, in my view, were really flagrant misrepresentations. And as I talked about with Keith Alexander and Mr. Clapper, were just false. Mr. Comey has been very blunt about his interest here. He was on the front pages of most of your publications saying, we want companies to be required to build weaknesses into their products. So he's not misrepresented his position. That's fair game. And by the way, General Rogers, the new head of the NSA, I'm sure to have some differences of opinion with him, but I'll tell you, the new head of the NSA came to see me. I asked him a number of very pointed questions. He said he was going to be straight with me, and he's kept his word.
Corey Bennett from the Hill.
Hi, Senator. I was interested in getting some of your thoughts about these ongoing China cybersecurity regulations, which has become a point of contention between the Obama administration and Chinese authorities. We found out yesterday that they are going to delay at least a portion of them, but it's become both an encryption issue with what China is proposing and a commerce and trade issue with the U.S. going to the WTO. We sent Secretary Pritzker, Secretary Liu over there. I was interested in getting your take on, first, how the Obama administration has dealt with this, and what, if anything, you think Congress should or could be doing in this scenario to help kind of facilitate some of these issues that have come up in these discussions with China over these set of rules.
Well, I can't get into the details of the rules, but what I can tell you, one of the reasons I felt so strongly about the provisions yesterday that deal with the open internet and the expansion of free flow of information is China in the last couple of years has moved in such a repressive manner. I mean, I look around the world, you take out a just globe, there are few, if any, countries that have moved so rapidly to reduce access to the internet and the free flow of information as China. So I'm going to kind of use that as sort of a lodestar to look at these issues. But the provisions announced yesterday, one of the principal factors I felt so strongly about the digital ones, and as you know, these issues with respect to free flow of information really involve a very careful balancing act. It's almost your head and your heart. Your heart says information ought to be free. Your head says, wait a minute, people have been out there sweating and toiling and working for the inventions. They deserve some protection. And I sort of see this because I'm a journalist kid. My dad wrote, books. And so, Ava, William, and Scarlett, every couple of years get this itty-bitty royalty check because Peter Wyden's intellectual property is being protected. And at the same time, you've got to respect, fair use. We had this wonderful show in Oregon, and I guess it went to Los Angeles too, called Blonde Poison, which was on the basis of my dad's books. It's always about striking a balance. You see that in the trade proposal as well. There's strong protection for intellectual property, which is as it should be, but there are also provisions to ensure we're not going to have, another PIPA SOPA. And just yesterday, I introduced with Jared Polis additional legislation to make sure that as you protect copyright, which is very appropriate, you don't discourage research and other uses, what is called fair use. We kind of circumvented the anti-circumvention rules. If you really want root canal work for policy and get to sleep, you can read that bill.
Mr. Lauder from Reuters.
Yeah, back to trade for a second. As you try to sell this to your fellow Democrats, what is the one thing that you're going to say that you achieved here?
We produced a proposal that is very different than trade policy of the 1990s. The reference point for Democrats is really the 90s and NAFTA and the Clinton deals. This is very different for all the reasons that I described. You start with the fact that my colleagues feel very strongly about labor and environmental, provisions. In the 90s, you wanted to make labor and environmental provisions part of a trade agreement. People just hooted. Nobody thought that was on the level. Here, they're going to be in the agreement. They're going to be enforceable. People, and I'm going to be making this point to my colleagues, have been concerned about the race to the bottom. Now we're talking about something that lifts standards up around the world. Enforceable environmental requirements. My colleague Earl Blumenauer in the House feels particularly strongly about this, done wonderful work in terms of fighting illegal logging and wildlife abuse and the like. This is going to help bring standards up. So the first words out of my mouth when I talk to a colleague who's a Democrat, because I think that's what you asked about, will be, here are the differences in policy between now and the 1990s, and I'll say I think opponents have made that case. They have made that case that trade policy needs a big-time upgrade, a big-time upgrade. The reality is most of those trade bills were written before anybody had any idea about iPhones and texting and the like. Trade policy has been in a time warp, and that's what I'm going to be talking to them. That's a good question. That's my answer.
What about the criticisms that have come up that the mechanism in here that would provide an exit ramp for a bad deal
but that's not really going to be effective because it's all coming after, pretty much the whole deal has been signed up, even though the president signed it. That you have to get all 12 parties to agree to reopen it.
I'll describe how it works because we've actually brought, the details. But the heart of the changes is to get more transparency up front. So that's the point of publishing the negotiations. That's the point of the transparency officer. That's the point of, everybody in America has these documents for months before a member of Congress actually votes. So I want to clear that the heart of this is to stack the transparency to the greatest degree possible up front, and that too has not been done. Now, under the old process, even if the committee voted down an agreement, it still got fast-tracked on the floor. The committee under this has new teeth. If a majority doesn't vote yes on the agreement, a resolution is automatically sent to the Senate floor that can turn off trade privileges for the trade agreement in that chamber. And never had anything, like that. This gives the committees, and I think it's fair to say a number of my colleagues on the Democratic side on the committee have not been bashful about saying that they're opposed to trade agreements. They can use this. And in fact, a whole host of the transparency changes will be helpful. For example, I think the staff access restrictions, which also speaks to your question about more transparency up front, they are ridiculous. Emphasize ridiculous. That changes with this. In the future, a staff member with clearance, say from the Finance Committee, will be able to go by themselves, see the documents, get the information, and then discuss it with other members of Congress who share their views in terms of being opposed to the agreements. That's part of a fair fight. It's part of a smart track rather than a fast track. So that's how I respond.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Sean Higgins from the Examiner.
Yeah. Hillary Clinton does not appear to have issued any type of statement on where she stands on fast track or trade promotion authority. Do you think she should, particularly as a former Secretary of State and as presidential candidate? Her opinion would have a great deal of import and weight.
What I can tell you, Senator Clinton has been a candidate now, we're on Friday, for 5 days, okay? My own judgment is she's off to a strong start. And she and I and her husband have been talking about these issues since, for well over 20 years. And I've been appreciative of them asking my opinion on a whole host of issues, economic issues. Secretary Clinton then Senator Clinton often asked my opinion with respect to intelligence matters when she was in the Senate. And I'm just going to leave it at that. She's been a candidate for 5 days. And I will tell you, I think, based on everything I've seen, because we all have television sets and iPads and stuff, I really like the fact that she's focused, as she did in those opening days when she was running for the Senate in New York, of really getting out in smaller groups and talking about policy, talking about issues. Isn't that a quaint idea? You should actually talk about policy and talk about issues. Sort of what I've thought was my priorities. So a candidate who's been out there 5 days, I can tell you, and I've already told you that both of them talk to me frequently about a variety of issues and have over the years. I think she's off to a strong start.
I want to ask you a 40-second question. You said at the beginning you saw the ice beginning to break, and we had this week sort of bipartisan deals on Iran, on No Child Left Behind, and on trade. Do you have a quick sense of why the ice is beginning to break?
First, in the case of SGR, I think the gridlock just didn't pass the smell test. I don't know if any of you watched the 2014 debate, but I had been chair of the Finance Committee for 14 days or something, and I had, I don't know, maybe a 6-month chairmanship or something like that. I went to Senator Reid and said, there's already been an agreement for a short-term bill. Any problem with my pushing to see if we could permanently abolish? He said, absolutely not. I'm going to tell the press. I think he probably told Lisa and told a bunch of people. He said, I'm for what Ron Wyden's trying to do. When I was wrapping up, Chris Murphy was in the chair. And this, I think, is the best response that I can give you, Dave. I said, we've had 17 patches of SGR. At the rate this place is going, we're going to be on patch 80 or 70, or you had, 70, 80. We're going to be on patch 80 by the time Chris Murphy is eligible for Medicare. He's the youngest member of the Senate. And so I think that in that case, and a lot of Republican senators told me in 2014 they wanted to vote for repealing it then. It had just reached the point where it didn't pass the smell test to defend the status quo. This was a broken, flawed, outdated system, and everybody was saying Medicare is the flagship in terms of federal health programs. Why is it tethered to volume? Really, I call it fees for volume. That's what Medicare has been, fees for volume. And now we've got a new system that's based on quality and care coordination and the like. So I would tell you in some of these cases, you could not go to a town hall meeting and argue for the status quo. In the case of the Iran agreement, I really think Ben Cardin, Bob Corker, Bob Menendez, all the people who were involved in it deserve a lot of credit. If you had said a few weeks ago they were going to get an agreement on review legislation, people would have just laughed at you. So it was really important.
We've taken you beyond the time by about a minute. Thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Let's do it again.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, everybody.